March 1962, Pensacola, Florida. 5 teenage boys go skin diving near a sunken ship. A storm traps them. A fog rolls in, and something rises out of the deep that none of them have a name for. Only one boy makes it back to shore. 3 years later, 2 of the most qualified deep-sea engineers take a submarine to almost 6,000 feet down and see something that shouldn't exist. I'm Carol Ann. Welcome to the In-Between. Here's the thing about sea serpents. They've got one of the longest, most widespread sighting records of any cryptid on Earth. Centuries of them, scattered across nearly every ocean and a crap ton of lakes. And they're still the hardest of the bunch to pin down. Bigfoot at least leaves footprints. The sea serpent has 3/4 of the planet to hide in, most of it pitch black, crushed under pressure that would fold a school bus like a pop can. And I hear ya, there's a ton of sightings in just about every large lake on the planet. We even have our own version here in Minnesota. But today, we are going after the big boys. Some of these cases you may have heard of, but I seriously doubt if you've heard them all, because I hadn't heard of any of them. And by the time we get to the end, you may do exactly what I did and stop laughing. Because once you understand how little of the deep sea we've actually laid eyes on, the whole question changes shape. Now, before we dive into the deep end, I have a confession that fits this story a little too well. This whole episode is about things slipping away into water we can't see into, and yet we just assume if something were down there, we just know it. I've got a much smaller version of that running in my own head all year long. Gift giving. I'm the one who keeps track of everybody. The birthdays, the anniversaries, who got what last year so nobody ends up with a repeat. And every single year, something slips through anyway. I'll buy the perfect gift in October, tuck it somewhere clever, and by December it's just gone. Not lost, gone from my memory until I find it again in February. For years, I tried to wrangle all of it with a little Christmas list app I just loved. But then the developer started stripping out the features I loved the most, one update at a time. I complained loudly, long enough that my husband, Mr. In-Between, got tired of listening, asked me what my perfect gift list app would look like, and then he just built it for me. And I love it. That app is GiftFlow. Add the people in your life, set a budget for each one, and jot down ideas when they pop into your head. GiftFlow tracks every gift from idea to bought to arrived to wrapped to given, so you never forget anyone or buy the same thing twice. You can even snap a photo, and it isn't just a Christmas thing. Birthdays, weddings, graduations, the baby shower you found out about yesterday. It keeps the whole year from sneaking up on you. It all lives right on your phone. No account setup or password. Zero data collection, so it's totally private, and no ads ever. GiftFlow is completely free to use for all the core functions, and if you love it and you want to unlock the pro version, it's just a one-time purchase, no subscription. Right now, it's only available for Android phones, so click our link in the description for that. But fear not, all of you iPhone users, your version is coming soon. So get your list together before the chaos starts, not after. And I hope you love it as much as I do. Okay, back to the ocean. March 24th, 1962. Brian McCleary, a teenager living in Pensacola in the Florida Panhandle, gets a call on a bright, sunny Saturday morning from a diving buddy named Eric Rule, who invites him along on a skin diving trip to check out a wreck near Pensacola Bay, an old sunken ship called the Massachusetts. Brian checks the weather, sees nothing but blue sky in the forecast, and says, "Heck yeah!" Within the hour, a car pulls up carrying Eric and 3 other young men, Warren Sule, Brad Rice, and Larry Bill, all ranging in age from 14 to 17. They strap a small inflatable life raft to the roof and head for Fort Pickens, an old Civil War fort facing the Gulf, where they can see the wreck sitting about 1.5 miles offshore. The trip out, it's pretty boring. They take turns rowing, the water's calm, and Brian's mostly thinking about how cool this dive is going to be. It's Larry who first notices something's funky. When they started rowing, the wreck was on their right. Now, it's on their left. They've been drifting this whole time without even knowing it. And that's precisely the moment their luck runs out. A north wind kicks up, the sky darkens fast, and a calm water turns choppy enough to start splashing over the sides of the raft. They decide to head back, but paddling against the current proves to be a losing fight, and instead of moving toward shore, the boys find themselves being slowly pulled out toward the open channel. After that, it's open ocean. They try flagging down a passing boat, first by waving their arms, and then by shooting a spear gun wrapped in a red t-shirt at it, but no luck. Then they spot a channel buoy and they think, well, let's paddle over there and tie off to it. At least it'll stop us from going out any further. But once they get close, they figure out it's way bigger than they thought, and the current has created a violent undertow swirling around its base. The raft gets sucked under before they can secure the line, forcing all 5 to bail out and swim clear before climbing back in once the boat pops back up. What follows is a genuine storm, hard rain, total darkness, the kind of weather that makes 5 teenagers in a rubber raft feel pretty small in the grand scheme of things. And then, almost as fast as it whipped up, the storm breaks. The wind dies down, and in its place comes something Brian describes as way weirder than the storm itself. A dense fog rolling in over completely flat, silent water. No wind, no birds, nothing. They sit there for hours waiting for the fog to clear. They can't go anywhere because they can't see which way to go. So as they're sitting around smoking to kill time and calm their nerves in a literal smoke 'em if you got a moment, Larry says, "Hey guys, I hear something." A loud splash breaks the silence, not far off in the mist, followed by the smell of rotting fish strong enough to make Brian start heaving. Then they all watch as a long, thick shape rises up about 10 feet out of the water before bending and sinking back under. What was that? Somebody says, maybe it's an oarfish. Somebody else says, oarfish don't do that. Eventually, Brian says the word out loud that the rest of them had clearly already been thinking. Sea monster. The quiet is shattered again by a high-pitched, whining, hissing sound that freaks them all out, enough for all 5 of them to decide to put on their flippers and jump ship. The fog was clearing a little, so they started swimming as a group toward the ship wreckage. It's starting to get dark by this time. The storm is whipping up again, the water's getting colder, and they can still hear something splashing behind them and getting closer. One by one, in the confusion, the group scatters. There's a shout and silence where a voice had just been. Warren screams, "Help me! It's got Brad! I gotta get out of here!" as Warren's voice is cut short as well. Brian, Eric, and Larry keep swimming, but at some point, Brian looks back and Larry is gone. He and Eric try to dive for him, but no luck. Eric's body starts to seize from cramps, so Brian puts Eric's arm around his neck and the two keep swimming with the wreck barely visible ahead through the lightning. A giant wave breaks over Brian's head, ripping Eric's arm from his neck. Once he resurfaces, lightning flashes and he sees Eric ahead of him swimming toward the wreck, as the long neck with a head and 2 small eyes breaks the surface and dives back down on top of Eric, dragging him under. Brian screams and keeps swimming past the ship. Brian has no idea how he actually made it the rest of the way to shore. What he does remember clearly is waking up the next morning in an old gun emplacement near Fort McRae, which is actually not that far from where they went into the water the day before, finding his way down to the beach and being approached by a group of boys who recognize him as one of the missing divers from the search already underway. The Coast Guard had located the abandoned raft and started looking for the group that morning. Brian's taken to the hospital at the Pensacola Naval Air Station, where the local search and rescue director, a man named E.E. McGovern, comes by to chat, and Brian tells him everything. According to Brian, McGovern takes the account seriously, telling Brian the sea holds a lot of secrets. Eric Rule, Warren Sully, and Larry Bill were never recovered. One body did wash ashore roughly a week later, which was identified as Brad Rice. The raft itself turned up 10 miles down the coast from where Brian had come out of the water. And by Brian's own account, the reporters who interviewed him afterward made a deliberate choice to leave any mention of a sea creature out of their published stories entirely. That's the account, in roughly the shape McCleary gave it himself back in 1965 to Fate magazine. A clear morning that turned into a violent storm, a fog that swallowed the boys whole, and something in the water that took 4 lives and spared exactly 1. Now, is that exactly precisely what happened out there? Here's where things get complicated, because there's a real gap between McCleary's account and the contemporary record. The Pensacola Journal and the Playground News both ran stories on the tragedy in the days right after it happened. And according to McCleary's own article, those stories don't match either his account or what the doctors at the Naval Hospital told him. One report has him swimming a little over 2 miles to shore, while Coast Guard and Navy rescue units estimated the actual distance closer to 5. The hospital said he'd been in the water for 12 hours. And by McCleary's own admission, the reporters who interviewed him told him outright that they wouldn't be mentioning any sea serpent in their coverage, since it was, in their words, better for everyone if they don't mention that part. So we're left with a genuinely tragic story. 4 young lives lost in the Gulf that gets reported one way at the time and then a very different way in a magazine 3 years later. That's not nothing. And it's also not proof of a hoax. Reporters in 1962 leaving the monster out of a small town paper, particularly when the surviving witness was a traumatized teenager, doesn't tell us whether something extraordinary happened out there or not. What we have, honestly, is one detailed, internally consistent first-person account from the only living witness, and newspaper coverage from the period that doesn't fully line up with it on some of the smaller details like distance and time. The bodies were never fully recovered, which means there's no physical evidence one way or the other. I'm not going to tell you this case is solved in either direction. It's the kind of story that's been picked at by skeptics for decades and never fully put to rest, mostly because there's nothing left to test. What I can tell you is that it's a tragedy that happened, made extraordinary by a detail that either got added later or got deliberately scrubbed out by the reporters who didn't think the public needed to hear it. But Pensacola has a problem that the next case doesn't. It rests entirely on one exhausted, traumatized teenager recalling the worst night of his life 3 years after it happened, with no corroborating witnesses left alive to back him up. But what happens when the witnesses aren't a single grieving teenager, but 2 of the most rigorously trained engineers in the country on a documented mission with matching stories from the moment they surface? July 20th, 1965, the tongue of the ocean, a deep trench off Andros Island in the Bahamas. Down in that trench is a tiny research submarine named Alvin, with 2 men inside who are about the most reliable witnesses you can possibly get. Alvin is a deep submergence research vessel, a small manned submarine built by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution to carry scientists into parts of the ocean no human had ever physically been before. It was commissioned in June of 1964 and named after Alan Vine, the Woods Hole scientist whose idea got the program funded. It's not very big, maybe the size of a cramped delivery van, but it was, for its era, an engineering marvel, rated to dive thousands of feet into total darkness under pressure that would crush an ordinary boat like a beer can. Over the following decades, it would go on to locate a lost hydrogen bomb off the coast of Spain and help find the wreck of the Titanic. In the summer of 1965, though, it was still brand new and still mostly unknown to the public. Marvin McCamus is Alvin's chief engineer and pilot, a Navy veteran who joined Woods Hole in January of 1963 and would go on to receive a Meritorious Service Award from the Secretary of the Navy for picking up that hydrogen bomb. Beside him is Bill Rainey, co-designer of Alvin itself, an ex-Navy submariner who helped build the thing he's currently piloting through the pitch-black water. These are two of the most qualified deep submergence specialists alive in 1965. Their mission on this fateful dive is twofold. One, get certified by the Navy as a good-to-go deep water diving vessel. And two, to inspect the Navy's Project Artemis hydrophone array, a classified Cold War sonar system built to detect Soviet submarines. They descend toward roughly 5,000 feet and then ease into a crevice another 300 feet below that, following a cable, and stop the sub. Now, the sub should automatically keep itself in one spot, but Marvin can see that they're drifting. He checks the sub's instruments, and the sub is stationary. Something else is moving. His first guess is that he's looking at a utility pole, a thick cylindrical shape down at the bottom of the ocean. It was not a utility pole. Marvin swings the sub around for a better angle. What comes into view instead is a thick body with flippers, a long neck, and a snake-like head with two eyes looking directly back at him. He says it looked like a big lizard with flippers, with two sets of them. Then it turns, shows its back, and swims up and out of frame before the cameras, which are set to photograph between 15 to 25 feet ahead of the sub before they can even get into range to take the shot. Marvin, understandably a little freaked, says time to go and brings the sub to the surface. He tells people about it afterward, but as he put it years later, what can you say when you have nothing to prove it? You get laughed off the deck. The sighting reportedly made it into Alvin's wet log, the rough in-the-moment record kept during a dive, before it was apparently removed from the official version. The first published account comes from Charles Berlitz's 1977 book, Without a Trace, written with J. Manson Valentine, which includes a transcribed interview that reads almost like a court deposition. The Berlitz account gets the year wrong, claiming 1969, which is flatly impossible since Alvin spent most of that year at the bottom of the ocean after its lifting cables failed in October of 1968. The correction comes from a researcher named Scott Martis, who tracked Marvin down directly in the late 1990s. Marvin confirmed the sighting and corrected the date to July of 1965, which lines up with the documented Navy certification dive in Woods Hole's own records. Now, the case isn't airtight, and I want to be straight with you about why. Manson Valentine sketched a plesiosaur for Marvin and asked him if it matched what he'd seen. Marvin said, yes, exactly that. Martis later, separately, showed him the famous Robert Ryan's Loch Ness photos and the Zawiyu Maru carcass photos from Japan. And Marvin said those also resembled the creature. That's repeated exposure to multiple reference images across multiple decades, which raises a legitimate concern about memory being shaped by the picture rather than the other way around. However, I do think there's a difference between Marvin's answer of yes, exactly, to the sketch of the plesiosaur and his answer that the Rhines photo and the carcass pictures resembled what he saw. So, you have two of the most qualified deep submergence professionals in the world on an independently verifiable dated mission, telling a consistent story across decades with documentary evidence backing the timeline. And you also have a creature description that rests entirely on memory, recalled years later after repeated exposure to comparative images. Both of those things can be true at once. It is without much competition, one of the better credentialed sea serpent reports on record. Here's the part that should bother you, though. Marvin and Bill weren't describing anything new. The thing that they watched swim past their viewport had already been described in almost the same words by sea captains who died 100 years before either man was born. Researchers cataloging sea serpent reports have tracked hundreds of individual sightings stretching back centuries, scattered across nearly every ocean and a goodly number of landlocked lakes. And out of that mountain of reports, regional folklore has given a name to dozens of distinct, supposedly recurring creatures. Nessie in Scotland, Champ in Lake Champlain, Ogopogo in British Columbia, Caddy off the Pacific coast, Altamahaha, Tahoe Tessie. The list goes on long enough that we cannot cover every named lake or sea monster in 100 episodes, let alone one. So we're picking 4 specific cases that share a striking amount of DNA with each other, separated by oceans and centuries. We start in 1848 with a case so well documented that it remains, even today, one of the gold standards of sea serpent testimony. August 6, 1848, the HMS Daedalus, a small sailing warship of the Royal Navy, is sailing home from China, passing through the South Atlantic on its way to St. Helena. Midshipman Sartoris is the first to spot it and calls the officers to the quarterdeck. By the time it's over, Captain Peter McQuay, his first lieutenant, the sailing master, and several crew members all watch the same thing for roughly 20 minutes. McQuay's official report to the Admiralty describes an enormous serpent with its head and shoulders held a constant 4 feet above the water's surface. He estimates this thing was at least 60 feet long. And from his point of view, he can't see how this creature was even propelling itself along. It has something like the mane of a horse going down its back, and it passes so close to the back of the ship that, in his words, had it been a man of my acquaintance, I should have easily recognized his features with the naked eye. That is, deliberately or not, one of the most credibility-loaded sentences in the entire history of cryptid testimony. The creature never even changed its course. It held a steady southwesterly heading the entire time, apparently on some kind of mission, not giving a rip about the ship right next to it. Now, McQuay's report wasn't published until more than 2 months after the sighting, and there's a possibility that his memory may have shifted slightly in that gap. A junior officer named Edward Drummond made drawings closer to the actual day, depicting a longer, more pointed snout with a dorsal fin, which doesn't perfectly match the sketches that ran in the Illustrated London News in October, sketches that McQuay himself helped direct. The zoologist Richard Owen, the guy that invented the word dinosaur, looking at the same report, said he thought it might be an elephant seal. McQuay said, "No way," and never commanded another ship again. Whether that was retaliation for embarrassing the Admiralty or simple career happenstance, we'll never know. What matters for our purposes is the pattern this sighting establishes, because it shows up again and again across the next century and a half. A long serpentine body, a head held above the water, something described as a mane, multiple trained professional witnesses, the kind of people whose careers depend on not making things up, and no physical evidence left whatsoever. Case 2 on that pattern. Gloucester Harbor, Massachusetts, August of 1817. An entire summer of sightings along the New England coast, taken seriously enough that a zoological society actually convened to take sworn statements from witnesses. A carpenter named Matthew Gaffney, out in a small boat in the harbor, watched what he called a strange marine animal resembling a serpent swim right by his boat. He described its head as roughly the size of a 4-gallon keg, its body as thick as a barrel, and estimated its total length at around 40 feet. Other witnesses that same month described something closer to 80 feet long, which is about the size of a full-grown whale, with a serpentine shape, shining skin, and short fins spaced roughly 20 feet apart down its back. A group of men aboard the schooner Caravan even fired a cannon at it. It disappeared under the waves and was never seen again that summer, at least not by anyone willing to admit it. Case 3 takes us further back and further north. July of 1734, the Davis Strait between Greenland and Baffin Island in Canada. A Norwegian priest named Hans Eyde watched what he called a very terrible sea animal rear itself up so high out of the water that it towered over the ship's upper sails. He describes a long snout that blew like a whale, broad upper flippers, and a lower body formed like a snake, with a tail a full ship's length away from where the body began. Another missionary, Andreas Bing, made a sketch of the encounter at the time. It's considered one of the earliest written sea serpent reports we have on record, and notice how many of the same elements are already present a full century before the Daedalus. The long snake-like lower body, the elevated head, multiple witnesses on a working ship with no reason to invent a story. And case 4 brings us into the 20th century and to the Pacific Northwest, where the pattern hasn't stopped at all. Sightings around the waters near Vancouver Island go back to at least 1892. It wasn't until 1933 that a newspaper editor named Archie Wills ran a contest to name the creature, and Cadborosaurus won. Caddy, as it's known today, has one of the most consistent eyewitness records of any cryptid on the planet, almost always described the same way. Long and thin, several humps along the back, a horse-like head topped with something resembling a mane or a crest. Several strange carcasses have washed ashore over the decades that true believers say has to be Caddy, including one found on a beach in 1936 and another, supposedly a juvenile, discovered inside the stomach of a sperm whale in 1937. So, lay these 4 side by side. 1734, the Davis Strait. 1817, Gloucester Harbor. 1848, the Daedalus. 1933 onward, Cadborosaurus. Different oceans, different centuries, different witnesses who had no way of comparing notes with each other. Many of them professional sailors with their reputations on the line. And yet the same creature keeps showing up. Either this is the most durable, geographically distributed hoax in maritime history, or something out there has been handing us the same description for almost 300 years. I don't know which, but keep in mind, 300 years is only the European record. The people who were already living beside those waters had been describing the same creature for a lot longer than that. Indigenous nations across North America already had their own deep, detailed traditions of serpents living in the water. And in more than a few cases, those traditions line up eerily well with the sightings we just talked about. Around the Great Lakes, the Anishinaabe and other Algonquin-speaking peoples tell of the Mishipeshu, an underwater being that combines the features of a panther with a long, serpentine scaled tail, horns, and spines down its back. Mishipeshu is said to live in the deepest parts of lakes like Lake Superior, guarding copper deposits, and whips up sudden, violent storms against anyone foolish enough to cross the water without showing the proper respect. That little detail, a creature tied to sudden storms on open water, sounds a little familiar. Further north and east, the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples tell stories of horned water serpents called Chipijkum and Weewilmik, while Wabanaki traditions describe Gluskaba doing battle with a monster that hoards an entire lake's worth of water. The Menominee tell of Mashonomek, a man-eating fish monster. And out toward British Columbia, where caddy sightings cluster most heavily today, the Salish peoples had long described huge snake-like sea spirits living in the waters just off the coast long before the first Europeans ever saw one, treating the creature as a powerful presence to be respected rather than a curiosity to be hunted down. Even Lake Champlain has the Abenaki traditions describing a lake serpent way before the modern Champ legend took shape in American folklore. What's striking is that almost none of these traditions frame the creatures primarily as monsters to be feared and destroyed. Mishipeshu is dangerous for sure, but also a guardian of resources, something to be respected and bargained with rather than just running away from it. Caddy's indigenous roots describe something closer to a powerful spirit of the water than a rampaging beast. That's a completely different relationship with the unknown than the one that shows up in, like, the Daedalus report, where the creature is simply a huge, alarming object passing a ship. These oral traditions don't prove a physical animal exists in any of these waters. That's a huge claim, and we have no evidence for. An oral tradition serves a lot of cultural and spiritual purposes that have nothing to do with zoology. But it's worth noting that the people who live next to these waters the longest, who know them better than anybody else, were describing something snake-like down there long before any ship's captain wrote a single word about it. Which leaves one obvious objection still standing. If something that big were really swimming around down there, surely science would have found it by now. That's a fair thing to assume. It's also, as it turns out, almost completely wrong. Let's start with an animal we know is real: the colossal squid. A full-grown adult's body alone can run roughly the length of a small car. But once you add the tentacles...
Testicles.
No, tentacles.
The whole animal is as big as a school bus and weighs in at about 1,100 pounds. For 100 years, science assumed we just hadn't found a full-grown one alive in the wild because they were rare, maybe even edging toward extinction. We were wrong. Turns out that sperm whales in the Southern Ocean eat colossal squid constantly. Scientists estimate that as much as 77% of the actual biomass those whales eat is the colossal squid. Run the math backward on how many it would take to feed that many whales that consistently, and the estimates climb into the tens of millions alive right now in the Southern Ocean. An animal the size of a school bus, tens of millions of them, and functionally invisible to us. For most of the history of deep-sea exploration, the only way to look down there was to lower a submersible into the dark water with enormous bright white floodlights. Seems like the obvious approach. You can't see in the dark, so you bring light. So for decades, expedition after expedition went down there, lights ablazing, and came back with footage of, essentially, empty water. Scientific conclusion for most of the 20th century was that the deep sea is just empty. Nothing to see down there. Enter one Edith Witter. She's a maritime biologist who'd spent years in submersibles witnessing the emptiness. But she had a theory. What if the issue isn't the dark? What if it's the light? Most deep-sea eyes are tuned to blue-green wavelengths, the same range as bioluminescence, which means many of them genuinely struggle to perceive deep red light at all. So Edith built a camera system that used far-red illumination, essentially invisible to the animals she was trying to film, and paired it with a lure called the E-jelly, a ring of blue LEDs rigged to mimic the distress display of an Atolla jellyfish, a creature that, when grabbed by a predator, doesn't fight back so much as light up like a pinwheel to summon something bigger to come and eat whatever's attacking it. In other words, an attack whistle. In 2004, she took the whole rig out to the Gulf of Mexico and just let it sit there, quietly recording, with the cameras running and nothing happening. Amazingly enough, nothing ran away from it. Ordinary fish swam past, not a care in the world, totally ignoring the setup that wasn't blasting white light at them. Then she switched the E-jelly on. 86 seconds later, a squid swam directly into frame, over 6 feet long, entirely new to science, a species that couldn't even be placed into any known scientific family. 86 seconds after decades of bright light expeditions had turned up almost nothing in that same kind of water. That one moment effectively rewrote the playbook. All this time, we weren't looking at empty water. We were looking at water that had already been cleared out the second we showed up. Deep sea animals completely adapted to see in near total blackness. Bright floodlights scare them off before we even get a good look, sometimes from nearly a football field away. Edith then built a more advanced version of the system called the Medusa, and in 2012 brought it to Japan to try for the most sought-after animal in all of ocean science, the giant squid, an animal that had never once been filmed alive in its own habitat in the entire history of human exploration. The Medusa went down with no white light at all, just the pulsing lure, and on its very first try, the giant squid appeared. The team got several separate sightings on that expedition and duplicated that success again in 2019 in the Gulf of Mexico. An animal that had eluded every submarine, every net, and every serious expedition for over a century simply showed up repeatedly the moment researchers stopped shouting into the dark and started speaking the ocean's own language instead. Even basic camera rigs dropped to the seafloor with no lights at all, just bait and patience, are turning up species never documented before, sometimes within a few hundred feet of popular tourist beaches. And in 2014, acoustic surveys revealed that the total fish biomass in the ocean's twilight zone, roughly 2,000 to 10,000 feet down, had been underestimated by at least tenfold. Not 10%, 10 times. Because traditional survey nets just couldn't catch what was already swimming away from them. The bottom line is this: we're still discovering entirely new species in the ocean on the regular, and the breakthroughs keep coming, not from bigger ships or brighter lights, but from quieter, gentler technology. The deep sea remains the least explored environment on this planet, and nearly every time we found a better way to look without announcing ourselves first, something unexpected shows up. That doesn't prove a long-necked creature is cruising around the tongue of the ocean right now, but it does mean the confident, arrogant, dismissive answer, the one that says we'd have definitely found something like that by now if it existed, doesn't hold up against what deep sea researchers are telling us in their own published work. So where does that leave the sea serpent? Pensacola is a real tragedy wrapped around an encounter story we can't confirm or dismiss. Alvin is one of the better credentialed cryptid reports on record, undercut only by the possibility of memory shaping with reference photos years later. The Daedalus and its 3 cousin stories give us the same creature, described the same way by witnesses who never compared notes, with indigenous traditions independently describing something similar long before any of those ships set sail. And the deep sea itself shows us how little we've actually seen. I'm not going to tell you sea serpents are real. I'm not going to tell you they aren't either, because nobody knows what's living in the deepest 2/3 of this planet. What I do know is that the ocean has been handing us the same description for nearly 300 years. Once we finally built tools patient enough to watch, instead of shouting into the darkness, something has shown up that nobody expected to find. Just imagine what might show up next time. So maybe the real mystery isn't whether sea serpents exist. Maybe it's why we keep assuming we'd already know if they did. Special shout out to Sakurano Hana for bringing the Pensacola sea serpent incident to our attention. I had no idea until they raised the flag, so a special thank you to them for this one. Speaking of dinosaur-like creatures evading us humans in the oceans, are dinosaurs still walking around on land? Could they be what we used to call dragons? Click here to find out. This one will blow your socks off. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on the In-Between.